What in God's name are you doing with my father? Have you no sense of decency? Julian Croft's voice cracked through the opulent quiet of the grand parlor, a sonic boom shattering the stained-glass tranquility of the afternoon. The double doors, thrown open with violent force, slammed against their stops, and the moment hung suspended in the air, brittle and cold. Clara Mayhew flinched, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Her arms, almost by instinct, tightened around the fragile frame of Arthur Croft. His thin silk pajama shirt was already clinging to his back, damp with the sweat of their short, determined walk across the Persian rug. She had just coaxed him to his feet, guiding his shuffling steps from the armchair to the window, when his old knees had given way. She'd caught him, a dead weight against her, his face just inches from her own, their bodies pressed together not by choice, but by the raw physics of a fall averted. But to Julian, who had just stormed in unannounced from the cavernous main hall, the scene was a tableau of something else entirely. "You filthy little opportunist," Julian spat, his face a mask of contempt, as he advanced into the room. "Is this your new game? Preying on a helpless old man when you think no one is watching? It's revolting." "No, Mr. Croft, please. It isn't what you think," Clara gasped, stumbling back as she tried to support Arthur's weight. She raised a hand defensively, her voice thin with shock. "He wanted to try walking today. They've reduced his physical therapy sessions, and She carefully lowered Arthur into the plush cushions of his wheelchair, her hand remaining on his bony shoulder to steady him. "Mr. Croft, I was only—" "Only what?" Julian snapped, his voice a whip. "Helping him into his bed? Keeping him warm with a desperate embrace? My God, don't you dare stand there and lie to my face." His roar seemed to shake the crystal on the mantelpiece. "I walk into my own home to find the maid grinding against my father like some vulture circling its kill. Do you think, because he's frail, he's an easy mark? Do you think his mind is as weak as his legs?" Arthur, still struggling to catch his breath, trembled in his chair. "Julian, stop it." She wasn't. But his son was a tempest, deaf to any voice but his own rage. "You gold-digging parasite," he hissed, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "I should have known better than to allow someone of your kind into this house, pretending to be so caring, so diligent, all while creeping around, looking for your angle." He lunged forward and shoved her, hard. Clara lost her balance, her feet tangling as she fell sideways. Her arm scraped against the carved mahogany leg of a side table, and a sharp crack of pain shot through her elbow. A thin line of crimson bloomed on her forearm, stark against her pale skin. A collective gasp echoed around them. Mr. Finch, the butler, stood frozen in the doorway, his usual stoicism shattered. Mrs. Gable, the cook, had a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. A young gardener, passing by the open French doors, stopped dead in his tracks, his shears dangling from his hand. Two junior housemaids hovered in the hallway, their faces pale with shock. "My heavens," someone whispered from the corridor. The whispers began to multiply, a rustling tide of murmurs. A maid leaned toward her colleague, her voice low but carrying. "She's been alone with the old man for hours, every single day. Who knows what else has been going on? Shameless, throwing herself at him like that." A wave of heat washed over Clara's cheeks, a flush not of shame, but of pure, unadulterated fury. Not a single soul in this vast, cold house knew what had truly transpired 3 hours earlier. Arthur had looked up from his book, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window overlooking the Atlantic. He had looked at Clara, his voice a fragile thread, but woven with a core of iron resolve. Let's try again today, Clara. Just a few steps for me. And she had helped him, patiently, gently. She had walked beside him, her arm a steady support, her voice a constant stream of soft encouragement. She had wiped the sweat from his brow when he pushed himself too hard, his pride warring with his body's betrayal. When his legs had finally buckled, she had caught him. That was the moment Julian had walked in on. Clara pushed herself up slowly, her body shaking, trying to steady the ragged rhythm of her breath. They cut his therapy schedule, she stammered, looking at Julian, pleading with him to see reason. The agency discontinued his in-home therapist 3 weeks ago. He begged me to help him. I was just following the routine Dr. Lawrence gave him. I didn't. He strode forward, his face a thundercloud, and grabbed a fistful of her blonde hair, yanking her head back with a brutal tug. She cried out, a sound of pain, fear, and utter disbelief, as he forced her to her knees. "You're finished here," he growled, his face inches from hers. "Get your things. Get out. And if I ever see you near my father again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." "No, please, please," Clara sobbed, her hands clutching at his wrist, her pleas lost in the cavernous room. "Don't do this. I didn't mean any harm. I don't have anyone else. My mother, she's ill. I need this job. I'll do anything. Just please don't take this away from me. That's enough." Arthur's voice boomed, stronger and clearer than it had sounded in weeks. He struggled against the confines of his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. "Let her go, Julian." Julian turned, panting, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. "You don't understand what she was doing, Dad. I know exactly what she was doing," Arthur interrupted, his voice ragged but resolute. "She was helping me when no one else would, because your precious staff and their meticulously managed budgets left me to rot in this damn chair." Julian stared at his father, his fury momentarily extinguished by shock. "She caught me before I hit the floor today," Arthur continued, his voice gaining strength. "She's the reason I can feel my own damn legs again. You want the truth, Julian? That woman has shown more compassion in her 2 hands than you've shown me in the last 5 years." Julian hesitated, his grip on Clara's hair loosening. The room had fallen into a heavy, expectant silence. He turned back to his father, and the expression he saw on the old man's face stunned him into stillness. It wasn't just anger, it was profound disappointment. Arthur's face was pale, but not from fatigue. It was ashen with shame. His mouth trembled, but his eyes were steady and clear. "I didn't raise you to be this cruel," the old man said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Not this." Julian stood frozen, his hand falling away from Clara's hair. She scrambled to her feet, humiliated, her pride shattered, her dignity in tatters. Her hands were still trembling as she wiped a smear of blood from her chin. And then she ran. She ran out of the parlor, down the long hall, and away from the suffocating judgment. The murmurs behind her didn't follow, only the heavy, echoing silence of guilt. Julian Croft stood by the tall window of his father's study, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw locked so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. Outside, the relentless New England rain had softened to a fine mist that clung to the ancient oaks on the lawn. But inside him, the storm was only just beginning to gather force. Behind him, the room was silent, filled with the scent of old leather and his father's pipe tobacco. Mr. Finch, the house manager, lingered in the doorway, his posture a study in professional uncertainty, unsure if he should speak or retreat. Finally, with a hesitant clearing of his throat, he ventured, Sir, would you like me to personally escort Miss Mayhew from the premises? Julian didn't turn from the window. No, he said, his voice clipped and cold. She'll leave when she's ready. This isn't a prison. Mr. Finch paused. Then, shall I notify the agency? Her contract. She broke more than a contract, Julian snapped, cutting him off with a wave of his hand. She broke trust. She took advantage of a vulnerable man in his own home. With a slight, deferential nod, Mr. Finch retreated, closing the heavy oak door quietly behind him. Julian let out a long, slow breath, finally turning his gaze to the old family portrait that hung above the marble fireplace. Arthur stood tall and proud in the painting, decades younger, his wife radiant beside him, and a boy of 12, Julian himself, staring up at his father with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pride. Now that boy was a man, hardened by years of corporate warfare, betrayals in the boardroom, and the relentless tyranny of the bottom line. And yet, he couldn't shake the image from the parlor. Clara's hands, steadying his father. They hadn't been seductive or calculating. They had been focused, controlled, simply human. He rubbed his temples, trying to banish the flicker of doubt. No, he couldn't question himself. He saw what he saw. Downstairs, in the guest wing, Clara moved through the small hallway with slow, deliberate steps. Her suitcase, an old scuffed black one that had seen better days, sat half-packed on the edge of her narrow bed. Her resignation letter was already written, folded neatly in the front pocket of her worn tote bag. She picked up a small framed photograph from her bedside table. It was her mother, back in their small town in western Massachusetts, standing in front of the little house they had nearly lost twice to medical bills. Clara had sent half of every paycheck home, without fail. Working for the Crofts wasn't a privilege. It had been a lifeline. Until now. A soft knock sounded on her door. Not hard, not tentative, but familiar. She opened it to find Arthur sitting in his wheelchair, his head tilted slightly, his tired eyes searching her face. He looked utterly exhausted, his body more slumped than usual, his left hand trembling almost imperceptibly in his lap. "I had Finch bring me down," he said, his voice weak but firm. "I had to see you." "You shouldn't be out of your bed," she replied softly. He offered a lopsided, weary smile. "Can't let a billionaire's temper tantrum be the final word, can we?" She stepped aside, allowing him to roll into the small, Spartan room. It smelled faintly of lavender soap and starched linen, the only light coming from a small lamp beside the bed. Arthur wheeled himself closer and reached into the inner pocket of his cashmere cardigan. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "It's from Dr. Lawrence, the updated rehabilitation schedule. You've followed it better than the last 3 specialists he hired combined." Clara didn't take it. He sighed, a sound heavy with regret. "He's wrong, you know. My son. I don't want to talk about him." "He's not a bad man," Arthur insisted gently. "He treated me like I was nothing," she said, her voice tight with a pain that went deeper than the scrape on her arm. "Like I was trash. Like I was disposable." Arthur looked down at his trembling hands. "He's afraid." Clara raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Of me?" "No," he said, looking up again. "Of himself. Of what he saw, and how it made him feel." There was a long, heavy pause between them. "I thought," Arthur continued slowly, his words carefully chosen, "that raising a son meant giving him all the tools I never had. The best education, money, a legacy to inherit. But I forgot to teach him something essential." "What?" "Discernment," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Clara finally took the paper from his lap, folding it once more and placing it on her dresser. You should be in bed, she said softly. You need to rest. He looked up at her then, his eyes damp with an emotion deeper than exhaustion. So do you. Back upstairs, Julian stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the shadows flicker in the foyer below. Something was pulling at him, a feeling he refused to name. Guilt? Regret? No, he told himself firmly. It was clarity. He was doing the right thing. His father needed structure, not sentiment. Discipline, not dependence on a hired girl. Still, he found himself descending the stairs, his steps slow and quiet on the thick runner. As he reached the guest hallway, he saw a sliver of light from beneath Clara's door. He heard his father's voice, a low and warm murmur. Then Clara's voice, calm, steady, like a melody he couldn't quite place. He stopped. He shouldn't listen. It was an invasion of privacy. But he did. Why didn't you defend me? It was Clara's voice, quiet but sharp. I tried, Arthur replied, his voice full of weariness. No. You defended your decision to keep me here. You didn't defend me. Julian's stomach twisted into a knot. I didn't have the words, Samuel admitted. I failed you. I failed him too. I'm not asking you to choose between us, Mr. Croft, Clara said. But I will not stay in a place where I'm not respected. There was a long silence. Then Arthur's voice, almost a whisper. Will you give him a little time? Clara's answer came slowly. Each word weighted. Time doesn't cure rot, Mr. Croft. It only hides the smell. Julian turned and walked away, his steps silent but heavy. Each one felt like a stone being placed on his back. In the days that followed, Clara remained in her room. She packed slowly, sorting through memories that weren't hers, but had somehow shaped the last year of her life. She avoided eye contact with the other staff, feeling the chill of their whispers as she passed through the hallways. She didn't offer explanations. She didn't plead her case. She was done explaining. The truth, she had decided, didn't need to beg to be believed. She was sitting on the edge of her bed late one evening, her suitcase finally zipped and ready, when she noticed a white envelope on her dresser. She hadn't put it there. Inside, a note was written in a precise, elegant cursive she recognized as Arthur's. You changed my life more in 8 months than my own son has in 40 years. If this house loses you, it loses its soul. She folded the note, pressing it to her chest. No tears came. She was past tears now. She had her dignity. She had the truth. But as she took one last look around the small room she was leaving behind, a sliver of something unfamiliar crept into her heart. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't fear. It was hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone else in this cold, vast house had finally started to see. The morning after Clara received Arthur's note, the Croft estate felt different. It wasn't quieter. A profound silence had always been a resident of these halls, but today it was heavier, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Clara stood in the vast, stainless steel kitchen, her suitcase parked by the back door, her coat folded neatly over its handle. Her uniform was pressed, her blonde hair tied back in its usual neat bun. She had no intention of leaving in a storm of drama. She would depart with the same quiet grace with which she had arrived. Mrs. Gable, the head cook, and one of the few staff members who had never participated in the hushed gossip, walked in holding a steaming mug. She set it down on the butcher block in front of Clara. "Chamomile for the nerves," she said, her voice warm. "I'm all right," Clara replied softly. "You don't have to be," Mrs. Gable said, her kind eyes conveying a world of understanding. "But you do have to walk out of here with your head held high." Clara managed a small, grateful smile. That's the only way I know how. They shared a moment of quiet solidarity. Then a voice echoed from the hallway, calm, direct, and unnervingly familiar. "Miss Mayhew, a word, please." Clara turned. Julian Croft stood there, dressed in a tailored suit, his shirt crisp, his shoes gleaming. But his usual aura of unshakable authority was clouded by something else today. Uncertainty, perhaps, or maybe even discomfort. "Mrs." Gable glanced between them, then, with a knowing look, slipped out of the kitchen. Julian stepped into the room, tucking his hands into his pockets. For a man so accustomed to commanding every space he entered, he seemed unsure of where to begin. "I owe you an apology," he said at last, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance. Clara said nothing, letting the silence stretch just a little longer than was polite. He cleared his throat. "What I said, what I assumed, it was wrong." "You didn't just assume," she corrected him, her voice quiet but firm. "You judged. You humiliated me in front of everyone." "I know." "Do you?" she challenged softly. He looked away, the muscles in his jaw tightening. No excuse I could offer would be sufficient. "I let fear do the talking." Clara's brow furrowed slightly. "Fear of what?" He hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the window. "Of losing control. Of seeing my father depend on someone else. Someone I didn't know. Someone I didn't trust." "You didn't try to know me," she stated simply. He nodded, meeting her eyes again. "That's on me." Clara reached for the handle of her suitcase. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Croft, but I'm still leaving." "I figured as much," he said quietly. "But before you go, there's something you should see." She studied his face. The smugness and manipulative edge were gone, replaced by a deep-seated weariness. He looked sincere. He gestured toward the hallway. "Please." Against her better judgment, she followed him. He led her not upstairs to the family quarters or into the grand drawing room, but down a long corridor toward the old East Wing. It had once been a nursery for him and his sister, but now, as far as she knew, it was used for storage. Julian opened a door she had never seen unlocked. Inside was not a dusty storeroom, but a modern, climate-controlled office. The walls were lined with binders, medical files, and photographs. Arthur's entire life was catalogued here, his rehabilitation records, security footage logs, detailed staff reports. "This is where I manage my father's care when I'm not here," Julian explained. "Surveillance, daily logs, everything. I review it all." "But I hadn't looked through the last 3 months." He walked over to a large monitor on the wall, tapped a few keys, and pulled up security footage from the living room, dated 3 days prior. The video showed Clara gently encouraging Arthur as he took his first unassisted steps in months. She stood behind him, her hands hovering, ready to catch him, but never clutching. She didn't rush him. She didn't offer effusive praise, just soft, steady words of support. Then he switched to footage from the kitchen a week before. Arthur was laughing, a rare, raspy sound. Clara was showing him how to make scrambled eggs with one hand, guiding his movements not like a servant or even a nurse, but like a patient friend. Finally, he pulled up the footage from the very moment he had walked in and exploded. The angle from the corner of the room showed it clearly. Arthur's legs had begun to tremble and buckle. Clara had moved swiftly to catch him, her arms wrapping around him purely for support. The inappropriate intimacy Julian thought he had witnessed simply wasn't there. It had been a projection of his own cynical mind. He let the video play out in silence. Clara watched, not because she needed proof of her own innocence, but because she understood that he did. When the screen finally went dark, Julian turned to her, his face etched with a shame that seemed to pain him. I jumped to conclusions. I didn't look. I didn't think. And worst of all, I didn't ask you. Clara's expression didn't soften, but her voice did. Why are you showing me this now? Because I saw the note my father wrote you. Her eyes flickered with surprise. I may not understand the way you do things, Julian continued, his voice low. But I understand loyalty when I see it. He trusts you. And he's different with you. Clara crossed her arms. He's vulnerable with me. That doesn't mean I'm manipulating him. I know. I believe that now. And I want to make it right. She raised an eyebrow. With a video and a late apology? No, he said, with honesty. And maybe a request. A request? I want you to stay. Clara looked at him, stunned. After what you said to me? He nodded. Because of what I said. I was raised to believe that weakness needed to be hidden, that vulnerability was a dangerous liability. You've taught him, and maybe both of us, that healing begins with honesty, with care, with being human. She studied him for a long moment. The man in front of her was still Julian Croft, the titan of finance whose name appeared in business journals. But there was something else there now, peeling away from beneath the armor, a crack of humility, a trace of truth. And if I stay? She asked cautiously. You don't answer to me, he said immediately. You answer to no one. You stay as my father's companion, his aide, his friend. And I stay the hell out of your way. Clara was quiet for a long beat. Then she said, one condition. Name it. You say it publicly. You clear my name to every single person in this house. I will not walk these halls like a ghost they tolerate. Julian nodded without hesitation. You'll have it. Clara stepped back, the small room suddenly feeling too small, the emotions within it too large. You've got a lot of work to do, she said. So do you, he replied. And just like that, something shifted. It wasn't a grand revelation. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was the first fragile stone being laid in the slow, arduous process of rebuilding something that had been broken. Outside, the sun began to push through the coastal mist. Inside, a man who had always judged too quickly was beginning to learn that justice doesn't come from assumption. It comes from truth, no matter how long it takes to finally see it. The Croft dining hall hadn't seen this much tension since the day Arthur had his stroke. The long mahogany table, usually a silent and dignified centerpiece, was now the site of whispered debates and nervous, sideways glances among the staff. Julian stood at its head, his hands planted firmly at his sides, his voice level but carrying to every corner of the room. Before anyone speaks another word behind a closed door, I will say this plainly. Clara Mayhew is not leaving this house. She never should have been asked to. Around him, the room went still. Staff members exchanged anxious looks. A few of the younger maids lowered their eyes to the floor. Others looked utterly stunned. Mrs. Gable, standing near the kitchen entrance, allowed the ghost of a smile to touch her lips. Clara stood to the side, near the fireplace, her spine straight, not out of pride, but out of necessity. Even now, with Julian's words hanging in the air, the weight of their suspicion felt like a physical presence on her skin. But for the first time, she wasn't the only one speaking the truth aloud. Every assumption I made, Julian continued, was based on a lie I told myself. That my father was too weak to know who to trust. That I was the only one who could protect him. I was wrong. He trusted her. I failed them both. He paused, letting the weight of his admission settle into the heavy silence. Let me be absolutely clear. Clara Mayhew has acted with nothing but integrity, patience, and profound care. If anyone here has a problem with that, then it is your problem, not hers. Mrs. Gable stepped forward first, setting down the silver tray she had been holding. Then, I think we owe her more than just our silence, Mr. Croft. A soft wave of assenting nods followed. Not everyone, but enough to matter. Clara's chest rose slowly as she took a deep breath. Her eyes met Julian's for a fleeting second, and he gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod. A gesture that acknowledged this was only the beginning of a long road. Later that afternoon, Clara returned to the sunroom, her favorite place in the vast estate. Arthur sat there, a book resting unread in his lap, a thick wool blanket over his legs, the pale afternoon sun warming his face. She hadn't spoken to him since the staff meeting. Not really. They had shared the same space, but not words. "Quite the press conference," he said without opening his eyes. Clara chuckled, easing into the wicker chair beside him. He rehearsed it. He's his mother's son, after all. She always knew how to command a room. He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you agree to stay?" she asked softly. Arthur turned his head slightly, his gaze finding hers. "Because I'm still alive, Clara. And people who are alive don't need pity. We need purpose. You could have found someone else." "I didn't want someone else," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I wanted you. You didn't treat me like a project to be managed. You treated me like a man who was learning to walk again." Clara looked away, out at the manicured gardens. Not everyone saw it that way. "They will," he said with conviction. "Eventually, they always do. Truth has a way of surviving much longer than lies." A comfortable silence settled between them, no longer heavy with unspoken things. It was a shared quiet, the kind that exists between two people who have weathered the same storm and found their way to the other side. As the days turned into weeks, the house began to recalibrate itself around a new center of gravity. Julian started staying longer each afternoon, sometimes joining them for tea in the sunroom, other times just watching from a distance. He never interrupted. He didn't over-explain himself. He simply showed up. One afternoon, as Clara was adjusting Arthur's position on the stone patio overlooking the ocean, Julian approached with a small wooden box in his hands. "I found this in storage," he said, setting it gently on the table between them. "I thought it might belong in the sunlight." Clara opened the lid slowly. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, from Arthur's younger years. Black and white prints of a stronger, more vibrant man, full of energy, posing beside sleek cars, smiling at his late wife, holding a tiny, serious-faced toddler who would grow up to be Julian himself. Arthur blinked hard, his eyes suddenly misty. "I thought these were lost." "You kept saying that," Julian said quietly, "but they were right where you left them. You just forgot where to look." Clara picked one up. It showed a young Arthur, his hair wind-blown, holding a fishing rod on a dock, his laughter frozen in time. She handed it to him gently. "Maybe we should frame a few of these," she suggested. Arthur nodded slowly, a faint smile on his lips. "I'd like that." Later that night, as Clara walked through the quiet halls toward her room, she heard faint voices coming from the old office. "She's changed him," she heard Mr. Finch whisper. "She's still just staff," came another voice, sharp and bitter. "He's only keeping her on because he feels guilty." Clara didn't slow her pace. She didn't knock on the door to confront them. She didn't need to. She had heard worse. But as she reached the bottom of the grand staircase, she caught sight of Julian standing on the landing above. He had heard them too. For a long moment, their eyes met across the cavernous space. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But in his eyes, she saw something stronger than guilt taking root. It was resolve. The next morning, Clara entered the kitchen to find a letter waiting for her on the granite counter. It was on thick, cream-colored paper, embossed with the Croft family crest. She unfolded it carefully. Miss Mayhew, as of today, your title is no longer household staff. You are hereby appointed as Director of Personal Rehabilitation and Senior Care for Mr. Arthur Croft. This role comes with full executive status within the household management structure. Your salary will reflect your new position, but more importantly, your authority will match it. Julian Croft. She read it twice, then a third time, her mind struggling to process the words. When she looked up, Mrs. Gable was smiling at her from the stove. "He's learning," she said simply. Clara nodded, still holding the letter. "We all are." That evening she walked Arthur through his exercises, slow, deliberate steps across the stone walkway of the garden. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting the world in a soft, amber light. His hand gripped hers for balance, his breath steady and even. "Feels like I'm reclaiming parts of myself I thought were gone forever," he said. "You are," she replied. They stopped at a bench near a bed of roses. He sat down heavily, and she joined him. "You know," he said quietly, "my son was raised in a world where power was the only language that mattered. You taught him another one." "What's that?" "Humility." Clara smiled faintly. "It's not an easy language to learn." "No," he agreed, his gaze on the horizon, "but it's the only way we ever truly grow." In the silence that followed, the sounds of the estate seemed to soften. There were no whispers, no judgment, just the rustle of the wind in the leaves and the slow, steady rebuilding of something far more powerful than status or wealth. It was trust. And though Clara knew more storms might come, she also knew something else with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. This time, she wouldn't have to face them alone. The sun was still a pale blush on the horizon when Clara stepped into the old greenhouse behind the Croft estate, a place Arthur used to frequent daily before his stroke. It was overgrown now, a beautiful ruin, but sunlight poured through the dusty glass ceiling, giving life to thick vines that climbed recklessly across the weathered wooden beams. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, but the air smelled alive, green, earthy, and full of forgotten memories. Clara knelt by an old workbench, brushing away a scattering of dried leaves. She found the old gardening journal Arthur had kept there, still wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the damp coastal air. It felt strange to hold something so personal, yet it was also comforting. In this house, where history had so often been buried or polished into an unrecognizable sheen, something so unfiltered was a rare treasure. She opened it slowly. Inside were scrolled notes in Arthur's firm, uneven handwriting, lists of seedlings he planned to order, sketches for a community garden he'd dreamed of starting, notes about staff birthdays, and even a passage about a young Julian, curious and restless, who had once been caught sneaking sun-warmed tomatoes straight from the vine. She smiled at the image. Behind her, footsteps crunched on the gravel path. "Julian. I didn't know anyone still came out here," he said, his voice quiet. Clara didn't look up from the journal. "Not many do. But I thought maybe this place deserved a little light again." Julian stepped beside her, his hands tucked in his pockets. He used to spend hours in here. Said it was the only place he felt truly grounded. "Funny," she said, "for a man who built empires out of glass and steel." "That was the problem," Julian muttered, more to himself than to her. He spent his life building things that were too tall to touch the ground. He forgot how to get his hands dirty. He watched her gently flip another page in the journal. He still wants to build that community garden, Julian added. He talks about it when he's tired. Says you'd help him. I would, Clara said softly. But not if it's just for show. Julian tilted his head. You think everything I do is for show? I think, she replied evenly, that you're learning how to tell the difference. He didn't argue with her. Back at the main house, Arthur sat in the sunroom, a soft blanket draped across his knees, his eyes closed. He listened to the wind tickle the window panes. Some mornings he woke with a fire in his belly, a restless energy. Others, like today, he was quieter, slower, adrift in his own thoughts. Mrs. Gable brought him his morning tea, and he sipped it slowly. She's in the greenhouse again? He asked, his voice a low rumble. She is, Mrs. Gable confirmed. With your son. Arthur chuckled softly. Maybe she'll teach him how to grow something other than his ego. Mrs. Gable laughed. Then her expression turned more serious. You should tell her what you told me. He looked at her, his gaze distant. Not yet. She deserves to know the truth. I know, Arthur murmured. But I'm not ready to admit I made the biggest mistake of my life. Not out loud. Mrs. Gable nodded, understanding. Then do it, before someone else does. That afternoon, Clara returned to the house to find a letter had been slid beneath her door. The envelope bore no name, just her initials, CM, neatly printed in gold ink. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cardstock. Miss Mayhew, your appointment as director stands, but I would ask that you meet me in my office at 4 p.m. today. This is not a reprimand. This is a conversation I should have had with you long ago. Julian Croft. At 4 o'clock sharp, she knocked once on the study door and entered. Julian sat behind the wide oak desk, the same one his father had used for decades. But the way he sat now, more grounded, less guarded, made him seem like an entirely different man. He gestured to the leather chair across from him. Please. Clara sat, crossing her legs neatly. What is it you want to talk about? He took a deep breath. I've been reviewing the estate's finances. That's not part of my department. It is now, he said, because a part of my father's legacy is about to get a second life, and I want you to be involved. She raised an eyebrow. Go on. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. I'm opening the community garden. Not for PR, not for headlines, but for real people. And I want you to manage it. Clara blinked, genuinely surprised. I want it to be more than just vegetables, he continued, his voice gaining momentum. A place for the elderly, for veterans from the local VA, for kids who have never had a backyard. A place where people can learn how to grow something together. Clara sat back slowly in her chair. That's a lot of trust to place in someone you nearly had thrown out. No, it's exactly because I nearly had you thrown out, Julian said, his gaze direct. You showed more character in the worst moment of your life than most people show in a lifetime. She considered him, the weight of his words settling around her. This garden? It'll need support. Tools, funding, outreach programs, you'll have all of it. Full control. Hire who you want. Fire who you don't. Clara thought for a long moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. All right. He blinked, surprised by her quick acceptance. Just like that? I told you once before. I don't need apologies. I need actions. This is a start. He smiled faintly, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Then we begin. That evening, Arthur sat beside the fireplace. He had asked to be wheeled there, insisting on feeling the warmth of a real flame instead of the filtered sunlight through the windows. Clara joined him, pulling up a small ottoman. "I hear you've been recruited into the gardening business again," he said, a twinkle in his eye. She smiled. "I hear you planted the first seed a long time ago." They sat in a comfortable quiet. Then he said, his voice softer, "There's something I've been avoiding telling you." She looked at him, waiting. "When you first came here," he began, his voice slower now, "I didn't hire you just because of your resume. I hired you because you reminded me of someone." "Who?" "My sister. She passed away when I was just a teenager. She was strong, clear-eyed. She never flinched when the world was being cruel. You carry that same fire." Clara swallowed, unsure what to say. "I didn't know. You weren't supposed to. But I think maybe that's why I trusted you so quickly. And why it hurt so much to see Julian tear you down like that." She reached over and laid a hand gently over his. "You didn't fail me, Mr. Croft. I failed both of you," he insisted. "But maybe we get to fix things now." She nodded. "Maybe we do." Outside, the grounds crew began clearing the overgrown land near the east wing. The soil was dark and rich, ready for a new purpose. Julian watched from the study window, not as a leader, not as a billionaire, but just as a son. A man finally learning how to plant something real. Clara stepped up beside him, her arms crossed. "You think it'll grow?" he asked, his voice low. She answered without a moment's hesitation. "Only if we nurture it." The first day of work on the community garden began with a thick morning fog blanketing the Croft estate. Mist curled low over the fields behind the east wing, wrapping the land in a hush of anticipation. Clara stood at the edge of the marked-off plot, her boots damp from the wet grass, her arms crossed over a soft flannel coat. This was no longer just a garden. It was a promise, taking root. She breathed in the cool, earthy air as the first trucks began to arrive, some laden with rich compost, others with tools and trays of seedlings. Julian had kept his word. Everything she had requested was delivered, from complex irrigation kits to plans for accessible pathways for elderly visitors. Still, she felt a familiar tension in her shoulders. Building was always harder than planting. Behind her, Mrs. Gable approached with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "You're out here like a general surveying the battlefield before the troops arrive." Clara smiled, accepting one of the mugs. "Feels more like a gardener waiting for the rain." "You'll get your rain, and you'll get your roots," Mrs. Gable said, with a knowing look. "Just don't forget to rest." Clara gave her a wry look. "Since when have you known me to rest?" Mrs. Gable chuckled and walked back toward the house. Moments later, Clara saw Julian stepping onto the grass, his sleeves already rolled up, a sight that surprised her. "You're early," she said. "I figured if I'm going to be involved, I should at least know what topsoil looks like," he replied with a hint of self-deprecation. She tossed him a pair of work gloves from a nearby box. "Then dig in." They worked side by side for a while, clearing thorny brambles and hauling bags of mulch. As they did, the volunteers began to arrive. A group of local teenagers, a few older veterans from the nearby retirement home, and 2 women from the local church who brought a basket of muffins and stories about their grandchildren. Each person brought something different to the plot: raw energy, quiet wisdom, infectious laughter, even a quiet grief looking for a place to heal. Mid-morning, an older black man named Walt approached Clara. He had a slow, confident gait, and a voice that carried both gravel and warmth. "You the one organizing all this?" "Yes, sir," Clara said, offering her hand. "Clara Mayhew." He shook it firmly. "Name's Walt. I fought in Vietnam. Came back and never had a patch of soil to call my own. Figured I'd give yours a try. Clara smiled warmly. You're more than welcome here. He glanced over at the rows she had outlined in the dirt. You know, this soil remembers everything. Blood, sweat, roots, even betrayal. She looked at him, intrigued. You think it'll forgive us? He shrugged, a slow, thoughtful movement. Not its job to forgive. Its job is to give us another chance. That sentiment stayed with her for the rest of the day. By noon, the plot was humming with life. Children carefully dug furrows and dropped seeds into the earth like tiny treasures. Elders leaned on their canes and pointed out where the afternoon sun would fall best. Clara moved through it all like a quiet current, guiding, adjusting, and offering encouragement. This was what she was meant for. Not just caregiving for one person, but cultivating lives, nurturing second chances for an entire community. In the distance, Arthur sat in his wheelchair under a large canopy, watching the scene unfold. Julian stood beside him. You see what she's done in a single day? Arthur said, his voice filled with awe. I see it, Julian replied, shielding his eyes from the sun. She's built more community in 6 hours than this family has managed in 60 years. Julian looked over at Clara. She was laughing with a young boy named Leo, who had accidentally sprayed her with the hose. Her face, usually so reserved and composed, was lit with an easy joy. She makes it look effortless, he murmured. Arthur glanced at him. You should tell her that. Men like you wait too long to say what matters, and then you wonder why the world doesn't wait for you to catch up. Julian was quiet, absorbing his father's words. Later, as the volunteers packed up their tools and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Clara stayed behind to sweep the shed floor and stack the unused supplies. Julian entered quietly, holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. Busy as ever, he said. She glanced up. You get used to the rhythm. The land tells you what it needs. He held out the paper. I found this in one of Dad's old ledgers. I thought you should have it. She unfolded it carefully. It was a page torn from Arthur's garden journal, written months ago. Clara sees people, not their roles, not their histories, just their hearts. I don't think I've ever been seen that way before. Clara swallowed hard. He had written this months ago, before the stroke, before everything had fallen apart. She tried to hand it back. He should keep this. No, Julian said softly. He wanted you to have it. He just didn't know how to say it. They stood in the quiet of the shed for a beat. Then Clara said, You've changed. Trying to, he admitted. The truth is, I never really knew who I was outside of control, power, business. And now I'm trying to be someone worth trusting. Clara met his eyes. It's about showing up. And you've been doing that. A cool breeze drifted through the open shed door, carrying the scent of turned earth and nascent hope. I want this garden to be permanent, Dorian said. A part of the Croft legacy. Then stop calling it that, Clara said gently. Make it part of the community's legacy. He smiled. You're right, she added. Put a plaque near the gate. For the hands that came before us. That way, no one ever forgets why it matters. Julian looked at her for a long time, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. You're not just rebuilding this land, Clara. You're rebuilding us. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Some truths didn't need an echo. They just needed space to grow. That night, Clara sat in her room, a little dirt still under her fingernails, her body tired in the best possible way. She held the page from Arthur's journal in her hand. and reread the words. Clara sees people. Outside her window, the stars blinked awake over the dark ocean. The soil of the new garden rested, but it remembered. Not just the pain and the judgment of the past, but the effort, the intention, the hope of today. In the distance, the newly dug rose lay quiet, seeds tucked safely beneath the surface, waiting, because healing takes time. But now, at least, it had begun. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm as steady and reassuring as a heartbeat. Each morning Clara rose before dawn, her steps leading her instinctively to the garden. The once barren patch of land now pulsed with color. Vibrant green shoots poking from the tilled earth. Sunny yellow marigolds standing guard over rows of young tomato plants, and the soft hum of bees weaving between fragrant lavender stalks. The community came faithfully. Walt showed up every Tuesday and Thursday with his endless supply of stories about war, weather, and women, though never in that order. Mrs. Peterson, a retired teacher, brought her grandchildren on the weekends, teaching them how to plant seeds with the same patience she once used to teach cursive. And young Leo, the boy with boots too big for his feet and a voice too small for his body, followed Clara around like a shadow, always watching, always learning. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of peace on the Croft estate. But peace has a way of making people forget that shadows don't simply vanish. They just step back, waiting for the sun to turn its back. On a warm Thursday morning, as Clara was clipping dead leaves from the beanstalks, she noticed Mrs. Gable approaching, her steps quick, her brow furrowed in concern. "Clara," she said in a low voice. "He's here." Clara stood up straight. "Who?" "Victor Sterling." The name struck Clara like a hammer against steel. Victor Sterling. Arthur Croft's former business partner. The man whose exit from the company years ago had been as mysterious as it was sudden. The same man who was rumored to have tried, and failed, to buy out Croft Industries before Julian took the reins. "What does he want?" Clara asked. "Claims he's here to check on Arthur," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dipped in distaste. "But he didn't even ask about him first. Went straight to Julian's office." Clara nodded once, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll keep an eye out." Inside the main house, the tension thickened as Sterling lingered. He was all expensive cologne and blindingly white teeth, wearing his success like a costume that was 2 sizes too big. When Clara passed him in the hall, he gave her a dismissive once-over, smirked, and said, "So, you're the one playing nursemaid and gardener now. Quite the resume." She met his gaze evenly. "And you're still playing parasite? How's that working out for you?" His smirk faltered, but only for a second. That afternoon, Julian called for Clara. She entered the study to find him standing by the window, his hands tucked into his pockets, a stance she now recognized as a sign of inner conflict. "He wants to invest in the garden," Julian said, without turning around. Clara blinked. "Sterling claims it will improve his public image. Says he wants to give back to the community." She folded her arms. "And what do you think?" "I think he smells an opportunity, not generosity." Julian turned to face her, but he also offered a hefty donation. Enough to expand the garden, build a permanent greenhouse, even start a mobile program for underserved neighborhoods. Clara narrowed her eyes. At what cost? He wants naming rights. There it was, the hook hidden beneath the honey. "I won't let him turn this into a billboard," she said firmly. "This place was born out of something real. It can't be sold." Julian nodded slowly. "I thought you'd say that. Then why are you even considering it?" "Because this house, this legacy, it still bleeds money. and I'm trying to keep it alive without bleeding the people who work here." Clara's voice softened. "There are other ways." Julian looked at her. "You really believe that?" She stepped forward. "Yes, because I believe in what we've built here, and I believe in the people who show up every day with nothing but their hands and their hope." He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "Then we'll find another way." But Sterling wasn't done. The next day, he returned not with an offer of money, but with leverage. He came during the lunch hour, strolling into the garden in a pressed linen suit that didn't belong anywhere near dirt. He smiled at the volunteers, shook a few hands, and had his assistant take pictures. Then he approached Clara. "You know," he said conversationally, "I'd hate for anyone to dig too deep into your past. Sometimes roots can grow in places they shouldn't." Clara's spine stiffened. "Is that a threat?" "Just a friendly warning," he replied, his smile never wavering. "Julian may trust you, but trust is a fickle thing. And the media, well, they love a good story, especially one that involves a so-called redemption." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Do what you have to do, but I won't sell the truth just to keep your secrets." He leaned a little closer, his voice dropping. "Then I hope you're ready for the consequences." That night, Clara sat alone on the back porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea. She hadn't thought about her past in years, not since she'd buried her younger brother, not since the court case, not since she had started her life over from scratch. She had rebuilt her world with honesty, with hard labor, with love. But she knew how fragile peace could be when someone was willing to poison the well. The door creaked open behind her. It was Julian. "I heard he cornered you," he said, sitting down beside her. She nodded. "He's going to come after me." Julian looked at her, his expression resolute. "Then we stand in front of you." Her brow furrowed. "We?" He turned to face her fully, his gaze unwavering. "Me. My father. Mrs. Gable. This house. You're not alone, Clara. Not anymore." Her throat tightened, but she held back the tears that threatened to fall. "I don't want this garden to be tainted by all of this." "It won't be," he said with certainty. "I've already called our legal team. We're going to expose him before he gets the chance to dig. The press won't see a scandal. They'll see a bully." Clara finally exhaled, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "You're risking a lot." He shrugged, his eyes still on her. "Some things are worth it." For the first time in years, Clara felt the profound relief of believing that someone else might finally see her for who she truly was. Not a woman hiding from her past, but one who was fighting to protect her future. The storm was coming, but this time, she wouldn't have to weather it alone. Clara stood in the kitchen early Friday morning, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, trying to brace herself. Outside the window, the garden glistened with dew, a peaceful scene untouched by the storm she knew was circling just beyond the gates. It was the kind of quiet that made your skin tense, like the charged air just before a thunderstorm rolls in off the ocean. She didn't have to wait long. By 9 o'clock, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Mrs. Gable. "You need to see this." Clara tapped the link. It opened to a local news site, one known for its sensational headlines and half-baked reporting. But the article's intent was crystal clear. Croft Estate Garden, director has criminal past. Court records reveal shocking truth about woman behind community project. Clara's heart plummeted. They had found it. A sealed juvenile record from over a decade ago. She had taken the fall for her younger brother, who had stolen medication for their dying mother. He was 17, terrified. She was 19, already working 2 jobs to keep their heads above water. The system hadn't cared about the context, only the charges. She had served her probation, had the record sealed, and kept her head down ever since. Now it was back, and it had claws. Her phone rang again. This time it was Julian. "I saw it," he said immediately, his voice tight with anger. "We're handling it." "How bad is it?" she asked, her own voice flat and distant. "They're framing it as a deception, that we failed to properly vet our leadership. But more than that, Sterling is using it to call into question the entire Croft legacy. He's suggesting this garden is just a PR stunt to clean up the family's image, run by someone with a history of manipulation." His words. Clara closed her eyes. They won't care about the truth. "We will," Julian said firmly. "I've already scheduled a press conference for this evening. You'll have the chance to speak, if you want to." She hesitated. "And if I don't? I'll speak for you." "No," Clara said, a new resolve hardening in her voice. "If this is my story, I need to be the one to tell it." That evening, the east lawn of the Croft estate was transformed. The media had gathered behind velvet ropes, their cameras aligned like a firing squad. A group of volunteers stood at the back, a quiet wall of solidarity. Arthur Croft sat near the front, bundled in a blanket, his expression calm and unreadable. Clara stood behind the podium, a soft sea breeze tugging at her simple braid. She wore no makeup, no polish, just herself. The murmurs from the press corps died down as she leaned into the microphone. "My name is Clara Mayhew," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm the director of the Croft Community Garden. I'm also a former caregiver, a former janitor, a former waitress, and yes, a former felon." The reporters stirred, some leaning forward, sensing the defensive spin they expected. "I was 19 years old," she continued, her voice steady. "My younger brother stole prescription medicine for our mother, who was dying at home. I was the only adult in the house. When the police came, he panicked. I took responsibility for his actions. I don't say that to excuse it. I say it because it is the truth." Clara paused, her gaze scanning the crowd. "I paid my debt, not just to the court, but to my own soul. I have spent every day since then building a life out of that mistake, not hiding from it, but learning from it. And what I've learned is this: people don't need perfect heroes. They need honest ones." She glanced toward Arthur, then Julian. "This garden was never about image. It was never about legacy. It was about roots, about giving people a place to grow, even if the world once told them they didn't belong. If that disqualifies me in your eyes, so be it. But it will not stop me from showing up tomorrow with a shovel in one hand and hope in the other." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a single, sharp clap. It was Walt, the Vietnam vet, stepping forward from the crowd, his face solemn as he clapped slowly and deliberately. Then Mrs. Peterson, then Leo, then others. Within seconds, the lawn echoed with applause, not polite or forced, but full-hearted and genuine. Clara stepped back from the podium, her chest tight with emotion. Julian took her place. If anyone here still doubts Clara Mayhew's place in this community, you are welcome to leave, because she is not going anywhere. And neither is this garden. Victor Sterling was nowhere in sight. But the silence of his absence spoke volumes. Later that night, Clara sat on the edge of the greenhouse, her fingers gently brushing over a sprouted basil leaf. The moon was high, silvering the rose of earth. Julian approached quietly, handing her a mug of hot tea. You told your story better than any press release ever could have. She nodded. It wasn't for them. It was for me. He sat beside her on the wooden bench. You know, my father once told me that vulnerability is the most terrifying kind of power, because it requires you to trust in people who might not deserve it. Your father's a wiser man than he lets on. Julian chuckled softly. He has his moments. They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of crickets and the distant laughter from a small potluck the volunteers had organized drifting through the air. Then he said, "You've changed this place, Clara." She looked at him. It changed me, too. He turned, his eyes searching hers. There's something else you need to know. Sterling's not done. He's trying to buy out the neighboring land to put in luxury condos. If he gets the zoning changed, this garden will be surrounded by walls, shadowed out. Clara's jaw tightened. Then we fight. He nodded. We've already filed an injunction, but we'll need public support. Signatures, media attention. This could get ugly. She sipped her tea. Ugly doesn't scare me. Not anymore. He looked at her, his admiration evident. Why not? Because I've seen uglier, she said, her gaze fixed on the moonlit garden. And I'm still standing. The garden around them was quiet now, resting. But Clara knew the next battle wouldn't wait long. They had planted their roots. Now they had to protect them. The weekend that followed Clara's public speech was a whirlwind of movement and intention. The garden had never been busier, not with the usual work of weeding and shoveling, but with people. Neighbors, volunteers, old friends of the Croft family, and a stream of newcomers who had read the headlines and decided to show up. Some brought food, others brought handmade signs, and many brought their own stories of redemption, injustice, and hope. Clara barely had a moment to breathe, but she didn't complain. She worked the rows with Leo, taught Mrs. Peterson's grandchildren how to properly stake their tomato plants, and met with Julian every evening to go over their campaign plan. Because that's what it had become, a campaign to save their small patch of earth. Sterling had filed the official paperwork to rezone the adjacent property for commercial development. His plans were slick, the renderings glossy and seductive, glass towers with rooftop pools, boutique shopping centers, and sprawling underground parking. On paper, it was presented as urban revitalization. In practice, it would kill the garden's sunlight and price out the very community Clara had just begun to build. On Monday morning, Clara found herself sitting in a church basement across from Reverend Thomas Green, a barrel-chested man with a voice like gravel and thunder. His congregation was one of the largest in the county, and his word carried weight far beyond the pulpit. "We've always supported causes with soul," he said, stirring a spoonful of sugar into his coffee. "But this garden, this feels like justice rooted in dirt." "That's exactly what it is," Clara said, her hands folded tightly on the table between them. "We're not just growing vegetables. We're growing dignity." He looked at her thoughtfully. "You've got my support. I'll speak about it on Sunday." "But Clara, Victor Sterling has deep pockets. That man could buy his way into heaven if he thought it came with beachfront property." "I don't need to outspend him," she replied, her voice firm. "I just need to outlast him." By Wednesday, yard signs began appearing across town. "Save the garden. Save our soil." Mrs. Gable helped organize a letter-writing campaign, and Walt got the local veterans involved. Leo's high school started a student-led fundraiser. Even Arthur, during one of his rare lucid evenings, dictated a powerful statement that Julian posted to the Croft Foundation's website. "This garden is not about profit. It's about healing. I may be old, but I know what matters. And this matters." But Sterling was never one to play fair. That Friday, the town council held a public zoning hearing. Clara sat in the front row, her palms damp but her knees steady. The chamber buzzed with a palpable tension. Sterling arrived late, sauntering in with two sharp-suited attorneys in tow. He greeted people like a seasoned politician, his smiles never quite reaching his eyes. When it was Clara's turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone with no notes, no prepared script. "This isn't about property," she began, her voice resonating through the room. "It's about people. It's about the kids who come to our garden after school, because it's the only green space they have. It's about the elders who share their stories while planting collard greens. It's about a man in a wheelchair who told me the soil made him feel alive again." She looked around the room, catching the eyes of each of the council members. "I know what Mr. Sterling is offering looks shiny and new, but you can't build a legacy on shadows, and you can't replace sunlight with steel." The applause that followed was brief, but honest. Then Sterling's attorney stood up. He spoke of growth, economic stimulation, jobs, and modernization. He used words like inevitable progress and market demand, but none of it felt rooted in anything real. It felt corporate and hollow. Afterward, the council announced they would take a week to deliberate. As Clara walked out into the parking lot, Sterling caught up with her. "You made quite the speech in there," he said, his